Maybe you saw on Tuesday of this past week the New York Times article with a sobering headline. The Buffalo killings are part of a pattern. Most extremist violence in the United States comes from the political right. End of headline. I'm thinking, ouch. It went on to give the striking data of 433 murders committed by political extremists in the past decade. 75% were committed by right-wing extremists. Islamic extremists were responsible for about 20% of those, and left-wing extremists were responsible for about 4%. And when you break down the 75% attributed to right-wing extremism, a full 73% of those murders were committed by white supremacists. %, by anti-government supremacists, extremists. And I am stunned. Not so much any longer, because we seem to have almost normalized this awful behavior in our culture. Not so much any longer by the awfulness of the ideology, but how often it seems to bleed into the minds of people and fester there in the minds of people of conservative biblical faith. That rocks my world. I'm not quite sure what to do with it. I think it's delusion. The scripture says that there will be ways that our eyes will not be able to see, but I'm just rocked by it. But in many ways, what we observe, how it seeps into the minds and fester in people of conservative biblical faith, is not unlike the faith of the Jewish religious authorities in today's gospel. And so against the backdrop of the first century Jewish context and the foreground of today's world, I would invite you to just settle into this passage for a moment, because I think it offers some truly helpful guidelines for discerning when right is wrong. Strange phrase, isn't it? When right is wrong. Right is wrong, first of all, when it becomes a cover for unbending ideology. Judaism of the first century of Jesus' time defined communal belonging around three practices: circumcision, food laws, and Sabbath observance. Each one of them important, and each one with a solid biblical, historical, and cultural grounding for how they got started and why they were important. In Jesus' time, a challenge to any of these meant a challenge to the ability to belong in the covenant community. Anyone, strike, you're out. You don't belong. These defined who can belong and who cannot belong, who will be included and who will be excluded from the community of God's people. It's an important question, isn't it? Who can belong and who cannot? What are the boundaries of community? What are the limits of biblical hospitality? Aren't those the questions that sort of press on us in our day? And we either close the doors and enclave, or you say, wow, what an opportunity we have to minister to a world like this. Thanks be to God. We get to do it and be alive at this time. Or we're somewhere between those two options trying to sort it out. That's probably most of us. You know, it could be our political ideology, whatever that might be. We're a pretty broad community here. It could be our religious ideology. But the question of this passage for us to consider is something like this. Is there anything in our existing political or religious beliefs or systems or structures that cause us to reject the model of Jesus? It's a tough question. I sort of wish I didn't have to ask it. It'd be a lot easier if it were crystal clear on every matter. But the passage points to a couple of key indicators that if these marks are sort of there in our lives or our practices, that we just might be leaning in the way of rejecting the model of Jesus in favor of our ideology. One of them is that when we tend to focus on the belief or ideology or the rule rather than on the person, we're in danger. When we focus more on the belief or the ideology or the rule, the law, we are in, rather than more on that than the person, then we are in danger of rejecting the model of Jesus. I mean, that's what they were really interested in. They didn't really rejoice that the man was healed. Isn't that odd? I mean, didn't say, well, congratulations, let's just have a little praise party here for a moment. No, don't carry your mat. Did you notice that in the gospel story, the first person they charge with Sabbath breaking is the man himself for carrying the mat? And then they move to Jesus. When they find out that it was Jesus who healed that day and told him to carry the mat, then he became the Sabbath breaker. You see, it was really the law that was more important than the person or what another person had done to help that person. The ideology, the law, with all of its good foundation, actually got in the way of what the law intended. Isn't that what the Sermon on the Mount is about, by the way? You've heard that it was said, but I say unto you. Doesn't reject all of that. He says, this is how you are to understand it in your place and time and culture. And somehow it's easy to have blinders around so that we are unable to fulfill the actual practical application that was intended in the first place. So when we tend to focus on the belief or ideology or the rule rather than on the person, another indicator or mark is that when we fall back on the power or authority of our position rather than engage in genuine dialogue. These leaders in this account, and there are others about Sabbath breaking in the Gospels. I won't bring those in. But these in this account didn't really want to have dialogue. They wanted to have upholding the law. They shut down dialogue. They weren't interested in the man's healing. They weren't interested in what happened to him. They were interested in who did it and who it was. And they weren't interested in Jesus' response, which will bring me to my second made point. But Jesus' response in verse 17 is that my Father is still working. He was cracking the door open for dialogue. It was a bold statement, wasn't it? My Father is still working and I'm working. And what they saw was something different. They saw someone taking the place of God and challenging the law. And they sought to shut it down. From that point on, it says they sought to kill Jesus. Right is wrong when it becomes a cover for unbending ideology. Secondly, I think this passage helps us in our day. It shows us that right is wrong when it fails to recognize or even explore. And here it gets scary, friends. The possibility of a new way. Did you notice that nothing in this story is by the book? That is, these people are there to get healed and they're there on the Sabbath. Either they just hang out there in sort of a squatter's place for invalids, or they're there on the Sabbath hoping that something might happen. If the water gets stirred up, they might be able to get into it even on the Sabbath. And so the authorities, because nothing is sort of happening by the book, the authorities are rightly nervous and protective of the faith. And then, as I've already implied, Jesus' words in verse 17 just rock them. My Father is still working. God is still up to something. By the way, do you know that God is always active? like there might even be something that God is doing right now. In my heart, in your heart, if somehow we can have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. My Father is still working, and so am I. It makes me think of that beautiful passage in Isaiah 43, right in the prophet Isaiah. I'm doing a new thing. Can you perceive it? That's the hard part, isn't it? How can I, with my narrow lenses and perspective, which are far more like the Pharisees than like Jesus? I promise. I confess, rather. How can I perceive it, and how can I know that it is it rather than something else? You see, this is why it gets frightening. It's not easy at all. But notice that even Jesus in this story, Jesus doesn't even follow the script of our expectations. He's not doing healing and evangelism by the book. I mean, I know sort of what we expect. We have healing prayer. That's by the book, you know. We anoint with oil, as James said. And we should. I want us to do that. But Jesus does his healing anonymously. Did you ever notice that? Jesus does this healing anonymously. It's like, I don't have to talk about myself in helping you, person in need. I don't have to declare to you that I am the Son of God and that you are being healed by the power of God that flows from me. He strips this healing of all of its theological underpinnings and undergirdings that we, of course, come back to the story with and prop it up with. And did you notice that he wasn't in a hurry at all to talk about himself, or to talk about sin, or to talk about forgiveness? When he meets him again, when the man searches him out, interesting, he sets the man on a road to searching. When the man searches him out, it's then when Jesus says, you know, this healing is more than your body. It's a spiritual healing too. There was a process there, but it didn't go by the book. It happened in sort of an odd way. Right is wrong when it fails to recognize or even explore the possibility of a new way. A third observation, right is wrong when it overshadows pressing need. Notice that Jesus in this story, he saw and he knew and he asked and he responded in verses 5 through 8. Jesus seeing was more than merely noticing that there were invalids here, that there were people who couldn't walk here, that there were people who had needs. It was a special attentiveness, and like a laser focus, his eye and his heart is drawn to a man who's been ill for 38 years. He focuses attention on the one with the greatest need. And so this passage just keeps pushing these questions that I'm too busy to hear. Who are the people? Where are the places? What are the circumstances in our place, time, and culture for such a time as this in which we've been called to live, where there is the greatest need, where is the greatest crying out for understanding and healing and embrace? Right is wrong when it overshadows pressing need. And then lastly, right is wrong when it becomes a barrier to human flourishing. Sort of a summary statement, I think, the overarching message, or at least one overarching message of this passage is that when we look at people, we are called to yearn with them and with God and for God's dream for them to blossom and to grow and to flourish. And to do it without fear of what someone else might think or how they might respond. And just embrace like Jesus would embrace. It doesn't relativize the truth. Rather, it opens up a way. It opens up a way for a hurting world to begin a searching path and hurting people to perhaps be connected to God, the God who forms and shapes and heals. You'd ask the question, what's the best thing? What's the greatest way that we can put people in proximity with the only source of true healing? How can we be a community with that kind of boundary? Can we put people in a place of proximity with Jesus? I've got to stop, but you guys look really sober right now. So I've got to go to Revelation just as a conclusion. Did you hear what we read from Revelation? If John 5 is about at least one thing that we can see there and it can help us to understand when right is wrong, Revelation is this glorious picture about when righteousness reigns. When righteousness reigns, and I can hardly do it without tears, because when righteousness reigns is so glorious, there is no temple. And because there's no temple, there's no Sabbath, by the way. It's going away. The thing that was so important that kept people out is not going to be there. It's gone. Or maybe to say it in another way, it'll be Sabbath all the time. It will be the glorious shalom of God reigning forever and ever and ever and for eternity. And there'll be no barriers between people, and there'll be no divisions between good and bad, or right and wrong, or left and right, or conservative and progressive, because everybody will be there in the shining glory and blazing holiness of God. And there'll be no second-class citizens or third or fourth class or nobody who you can write a manifesto about and say that you got to get rid of them off of the earth. Because of the beauty of all people will be seen and it'll be celebrated. And there'll be no evil and no hatred and no abominations. And instead of a still pool surrounded by people yearning to be whole. Instead of that, there will be a healing river. There'll be a river of the water of life flowing down in the midst of all creation. And on its leaves will be the source and the therapy for healing for everybody and for every need. That's where it ends. And our call as the people of God is to do our best to approximate that great, grand, beatific vision in whatever ways we can. We'll never get there. But the question is, how can we approximate it in our place, in our time, and in our day? May God help us. Amen.